Welcome to the University of Cambridge Centre for Geopolitics discussion on the Baltic States 1939 to 40, 80 years on. I firstly want to welcome you to this webinar and hope that you enjoy it. And I want to thank Professor Brendan Sims and his staff at the Centre for Geopolitics for both thinking about this and arranging it. We meet on quite a significant day. In Cambridge, where I am and one of our panelists, Patrick, it's the hottest day of the year. In Estonia, it's St. John's Day, Midsummer's Eve, where Kaya is. It's a national holiday, and Kaya, who I'll introduce in a moment, we're very grateful to you for coming this evening. It's also Victory Day, the anniversary of June the 23rd in 1919, when the Estonians defeated the Germans at the Battle of Sasis to win their independence, an illustration of the early complex of relationships from which Baltic independence has grown. Today has also been the postponed Moscow Victory Parade of the 75th anniversary of 1945. It's postponed because of the COVID situation, but Putin was determined to keep going with it. To create a climate for that event, he wrote a piece, The Real Lessons, in the national interest 6 days ago, setting out his version of the narrative of Soviet and Russian history over this whole long period. It's worth reading Edward Lucas in the Times this Monday, Why Putin's History Essay Requires a Rewrite, taking up a number of the points made by President Putin. But it simply makes the point we're meeting at an interesting time, and these events of 80 years still rebound into the politics of today. This is an online video panel. It will end at 19:15 sharp, so 75 minutes altogether. And we're going to divide the session into 3 parts. Firstly, setting the context, 1940 and into the Cold War, which will be the first 20 minutes or so of our discussion. Secondly, why does it all matter now? Why do we care? And thirdly, how does the future look? So I'm hoping that we'll conduct the conversation in a way which reflects that partition. In each of those sessions, I'll ask our 3 panelists, who I'll introduce in a second, a number of questions. And I will also try to relay questions from the audience to our panelists during the sessions and at the end. You as the audience will be able to see and hear me and the panelists. You'll have your microphone and camera switched off automatically, so at no time will you be heard or seen by anybody in the webinar. However, you're still able to communicate with me and the panelists. At the bottom of your screen, you will see a Q&A switch, an option. Click on it, and when it opens, you have the chance to type any questions that you'd like. If you do type questions, please start by writing your name and any affiliation. If your question's for a specific panel, please make sure to state that at the outset as well. And I'll try and include as many questions as I can in the process. I'd be grateful if you could reflect the kind of structure I described earlier on of the 3 parts, setting the context, why does it matter now, how does the future look, when asking your questions. Finally, I also want to let you know that this video panel is being recorded, and we will post the recording on our website over the next few days. So let me just begin by introducing myself and the panel. I've had a life in politics in Britain, but I became very involved in what happened in Estonia, particularly of the Baltic States, because my wife's, Carol's mother, fled Estonia in front of the Russian offensive in September 1944 and ended up in the UK and married her husband, Carol's father. Carol's uncle, her mother's brother, was a leader of the campaign to re-establish Estonian independence after the Russians came in. He was arrested in 1940, interrogated, and then shot by the NKVD. Her grandfather, a Social Democrat mayor of the town of Viljandi in the middle of Estonia, and grandmother were also arrested, interrogated, and then deported to Siberia, where they died. It was obviously a dramatic story, completely new to me, in which it was for many years difficult or even impossible to find the truth about what happened. We first visited Estonia in 1988 and went to Viljandi, which no one from outside the Soviet Union had visited since 1944. So that's my interest and involvement, and why I'm grateful to Brendan for asking me to chair this today. The panel is, first of all, includes Kaya Tail, He was the former Estonian ambassador to the UK in 2001 to 2006, which is where I first met her, and later Estonian ambassador to Germany and the European Union. She's now the Estonian ambassador at large for climate and energy policy. And as I said, Kaya, we're delighted that on Midsummer's Eve, St. John's Day, you're able to give a bit of time to this seminar today, because I know that national holiday is a time of joy. Mm-hmm. Secondly, Christina Spoer is professor at the London School of Economics. She wrote a number of books in this area, Post-War, Post-Square in 2019, and Germany and the Baltic Problem after the Cold War. She's also turned up a recent essay she wrote some while ago on Finland and the Baltics between 1917 and 1945, which informs our thinking. She's now also at Johns Hopkins University, and she's in a studio of theirs, or has a backdrop of theirs in Washington, which is where she is at the moment. Kaya is in Tallinn. And then thirdly, Patrick Salmon, who's based at his home in Cambridge, is chief historian at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office and an expert on Britain's relationship with the Baltic. He was a co-editor of The Baltic Nations in Europe, which was published in 2014. He's speaking here in his own capacity, not formally on behalf of the British government, but he is very familiar with all of these issues. So firstly, to the three of you, we're really delighted that you're ready to be part of this panel, and I'm just going to go straight into this. Setting the context, 1940 and into the Cold War. I'm going to ask Kaya first, if she can start by explaining, perhaps with some personal references, briefly, the history of the independent Baltic states and what then happened in 1940. And then I'll ask Christina to add to whatever Kaya has to say. So Kaya, any thoughts on that would be very welcome, please.
Thank you so much. And good evening to everybody who is watching and listening. I'm delighted that this subject is of some interest to the contemporary world. But to make the long story very brief, the Baltic states were born out of the collapse of the pre-World War First world order. So we also had to fight our wars of independence, but we emerged as rather strong nation states, I would claim, and this is no accident. The nation building had been going on in the Baltics since the 19th century. So I would claim that the Baltic states were quite viable economically, and also rather strong democratic states up to a certain point in 1930s when everything was going in the wrong direction in Europe anyhow. So what hit us in 1940, or actually we should speak about 1939, what hit us was another rearrangement of the world order. This time it was Hitler-Stalin Pact, and of course, after the Second World War, it was already the post-World War II world order. Now, coming back to this a bit artificial milestone, 1940, I can say that I am really lucky enough to have first-hand memories from the generation who really experienced it. My mother was a young girl in high school, not from an affluent background, modest family, not well rehearsed in the contemporary politics, I'm quite sure, but I was always struck by the clarity of her vision and the family's vision of the events. And there was a telltale sign in Estonia, at least. This was the exodus of the Baltic Germans. This was, of course, arranged as an agreement between Hitler and Stalin, or actually the foreign ministers. And I always remember my mother saying, well, there was absolutely no doubt anymore, we were left for the Russians. And not many people actually talk about this. I was also lucky because my family did, but many people suppressed those memories because, of course, it was outright dangerous to talk about it. But even so, 1940 does not really figure prominently in our sort of national recollection. It might be that it's because of much more traumatic events which followed, in the Second World War, of course, the Soviet occupation with its murders and deportations. But it might also be that we're just ashamed, literally ashamed what happened in 1939 when the Baltic governments surrendered to the ultimatum from the Soviet Union. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Kai. That's very graphic. Christina, could I ask you just to take it on from there as to how you see the history of the countries and their relationships with what happened in 1940?
Yes, and let me also thank you very much for taking part from Washington here. But I start off also with a personal angle because it fits interestingly with Kaya's, because I'm actually German-Finnish. And my grandfather, who only died a couple of years ago, was born in 1911, when Finland was still a great Grand Duchy. And of course, if we look at the Baltic Sea region and we look at the countries that gained independence in the context of the Bolshevik Revolution and the end of World War I, it was the 3 Baltic states and Finland and Poland. And this is, of course, something what we are looking at, because what brings them together was, of course, always that security question. And also, when one looks at this, it's often that the 3 countries, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, are lumped together. But what I would like to highlight is that while in security political terms and this concern of being somehow between Germany and Russia and this cordon sanitaire, we look at them as sort of a pan-Baltic area or a region, they were very different. They were similar in the sense that in Latvia and Estonia, you had strong German cultural ties already because of the Teutonic Knights who had gotten to those places in the 12th century. So culturally, the German elites were important as elites. So getting the independence was also for the population and their own languages, you know, it was also in some ways a bit counter to those elites. Not just Russia, there's in some ways you have to think about 2 types of elites. In Lithuania also you have Polish gentry. You look at different kinds of religion. Some are Protestant, Lithuania is very Catholic. They are not all the same. You had land reform, you had a movement towards industrialization, and you had the creation of new democracies. And the aim of these small independent states as independent actors was to make these democracies viable. Now, what is interesting is that whereas Finland took a more presidential system, once it declared itself a republic in 1919, really these states are all on the map in 1920 once they have a peace treaty with the Soviet Union. And in Estonia and Latvia, you have a very strong parliamentary democracy, more akin to like the Weimar Republic. And that was problematic for making this stable because you had so many different parties. That explains also why in the wider international context, as we see in turns to the right in the 1930s after the world economic crisis, and we see this movement towards, you know, strong leadership, more leaning to the right and perhaps also looking a little bit more to Germany. But what I want to stress is that you have very different countries that move on with education, that move on with modernization, that look westwards in terms of pop culture, art, the economy. Yeah, very Western oriented. And this is something that's very important for us to understand why they could establish themselves so well also after the Second World War. And just one brief point on this 1939-1940. The Hitler-Stalin Pact, and it's very important to call it that way because even if it was signed by Molotov and Ribbentrop, it is a pact between those 2 countries led by those 2 men. And interestingly, when you go back, you can see these documents now online. The Russians made them available. You can read them in Russian and in German. And the way Finland and the 3 Baltic republics are lumped together as Baltic states that will fall to Russia as part of territorial political reshaping. And where you see a difference is what the Estonian historian has called silent submission. You had the basis treaties where the Soviets could establish bases in Estonia, Latvia, and so forth. But the incorporation was not part of this. So the Estonian historian has called this more like a silent submission. But, you know, Putin has mentioned this, that, you know, there was this element of supposed consent. But look at what Russia did in Finland. They invaded. We had the Winter War. It wasn't that the Soviet Union was peaceful in 1939 either. Of course, there's also what happened in Poland. But just to point this out to you, if you look at it from today's perspective, the Baltics get picked out, but the neighboring states also had issues, and we had one war north of Estonia in that year, 1939-1940.
Christina, thank you very much. We've had a question from Mehdi Askaria, the research director of the Harwell campus in Oxford, and I'll just read it out. Did the three Baltic states always have separate national identities? Question mark. If not, when did the separate national identities set in? I think, Christina, you've answered that really in what you've said. Is there any timing point that you'd add to your description in response to Mehdi's question?
I just think it was important in the 1920s, as they each developed themselves, that, for example, something you see also in the 1990s, Estonia and Finland had very close cultural and also political ties. Latvia had also the German elites. They were very much on the forefront with minority rights by this guy, Paul Szyman, who was in Riga. And Poland had, Lithuania was much more in some ways Poland oriented, but had also issues with regard to territory with both Poland and Germany. If you think about Memel and Vilnius, they were very different.
Thank you. I'm now going to ask Patrick to comment on what was Britain's role, both before 1940 and then until the end of the Cold War. In a sense, what's all this got to do with Britain? What was the UK doing in any of this? Was it an area of interest, whatever? Patrick, could you just give us some of the background and explain what Britain's engagement with this part of the world was and is?
Well, I suppose you could say that Britain's policy towards the Baltic states really over the last 100 years has alternated between short periods of interest and support and much longer periods of indifference and neglect. The first short period was between about 1918 and 1922. In the early part of that phase, you see the Royal Navy giving a lot of support to the Estonian and Latvian independence movements, and also British military and civilian missions. General Gough, Colonel Harold Alexander, later Alexander of Tunis, commanding a German force in support of Latvia. These things get very complicated. And that period, I think, goes up to about 1922, when the last of the three Baltic states obtained international diplomatic de jure recognition. You then have a long period in the 1920s and 30s where there is British interest, but it's primarily to do with commerce. And the British diplomats are very, very concerned that they should not give any false hopes to the Baltic states. The British already, although they remain a significant naval power, even in the Baltic up until the Anglo-German Naval Agreement of 1935, are already thinking when it comes to the crunch, we won't be able to do very much in support of the Baltic states, whether in relation to Germany or in relation to Russia. And in a way, that feeling that you can't do very much in the Baltic goes right up to 1991. And again, you get degrees of support and degrees of indifference and degrees of actually, extremely bad behavior towards the Baltics. One example would be the deprivation of a large element of diplomatic recognition in 1942 at the behest of the Soviet Union. And perhaps the most humiliating of all was the Baltic Gold episode in the late 1960s, when, I have to say, Charles, a Labour government gave all the Baltic gold to the Soviets. And that injustice was, of course, redressed after they regained their independence. Now, that, I think, in a way, is in one sense, a rather disappointing British record. But I think you have to see it in terms of the extreme, in a way, realism and pragmatism of British policy in almost every period. The British really, for most of the 20th century, did not believe that they could operate, above all, as a naval power in the Baltic. They did so very successfully between the 17th and the 19th centuries. And even in the early 20th century, Admiral Jackie Fisher was talking about Copenhagening the German fleet in the Baltic. He famously said, Berlin is only 90 miles from the German coast, we can easily land a force there, this sort of thing. And in fact, you could argue that only two people in the 20th century really believed that Britain could be a Baltic power. And one was Jackie Fisher and the other was Winston Churchill. And at the beginning of both world wars, actually, Churchill tried to launch Baltic initiatives, Baltic interventions. He was diverted towards the Dardanelles in 1915, and you could say he was diverted towards Norway in 1940. So both those plans came to nothing. But Churchill, I think, is an interesting figure, and he never really lost interest in that part of the world. If you add that his interest in intervention against Russia, against the new Bolshevik regime at Archangel and Murmansk, you can see there's a consistent pattern there. This is disappointing, I think. It's a disappointing story to Baltic politicians who persistently hoped that Britain would, in the last resort, come to their defence. And it's quite interesting if you read British authors in the 1920s and 30s who wrote about Britain's presence in the Baltic. They all said, the Baltic's looking to Britain, why can't Britain do a little bit more? But I think that really is a recognition of Britain's feeling that with its worldwide commitments, its imperial overstretch, it really couldn't do very much. And then when you move into the Soviet era, well, first of all, there's a feeling of impotence. You don't give full diplomatic recognition, obviously, to Soviet sovereignty. You maintain that it's de facto only. But right up to the end of the Soviet period, under Gorbachev, there is extreme ambivalence about whether or not or how to support the movements for Baltic independence.
You mentioned, Patrick, that some Baltic leaders felt disappointed in British engagement at various points. Was that very explicit in your view? Was it just in normal diplomatic things? I don't know, after you respond, Patrick, whether Kaya would like to add anything on that point. But I'd be interested to know how bad the problem was that you've described.
Well, I think what would happen would be that a Baltic foreign minister would come to London. Merovitz, for instance, from Latvia, would come to talk to Austin Chamberlain, and he would say something like, well, could Britain see itself able to support an Eastern Locarno, to have an equivalent in Eastern Europe of what they'd done with the Locarno Treaty in Western Europe? And Austin Chamberlain said, well, no, it's not quite what we could do at the moment. Would Britain support any moves towards defence cooperation between Baltic states and maybe Poland or Finland? Well, it's not really for us to advise. You know, it's a rather classic British position. But Kaya might want to say more.
Kaya, what are your reflections on that point?
Sorry. I'm sure Patrick actually knows more what went on in the UK in the thinking, but I would just say that we mustn't forget that the Baltic states were truly unsuccessful in building alliances, any alliances, not only with the UK, but also amongst themselves, with Finland or with Poland. And I'm actually not blaming anyone in this. The world was actually, I would say, sleepwalking into the World War II. It's not only World War I we have sleepwalked into, but on the eve of the World War II, there was no functioning multilateral system. And taking this into regard, with the absence of this system, people made bad choices. And sometimes they were quite personal choices. And as for the Baltic states' British orientation, yes, there was something like this, but I must say that actually much more was, at least the Estonian government, looking towards Germany, trying to play out the German card against the Russian aggression and the threat. And this, of course, ended as it did. And with the hindsight, we are all wiser. But at that particular point, I think it's a very good lesson to be drawn that we actually need a multilateral international system. And even in the contemporary world, we are only halfway towards this.
Can I just come off the back of that, Kaya, thanks, to ask Christina to comment on the way in which the conflict between Germany and Russia impacted on the Baltic states. To what extent was the big question, you've already mentioned Stalin-Hitler Pact and the secret protocol, but to what extent was the big German-Russian relationship one which simply left the Baltic states as a residual, or were there other aspects? And just as part of that, what was Poland's influence? Kaya just mentioned Poland as well in that answer. And Christina, I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about that. And I'll then make your response now, Christina, the last of our first session, and then we'll move on to how it all operates now. But I think, Christina, any insight you could give us on that would be extremely helpful.
Yeah, so let me maybe perhaps use this also as a leap in some ways out of the interwar period into the Cold War period, because that German-Russian relationship actually plays out even in the Cold War and beyond. Quickly on that point on Poland and if you think about Lithuania, I mean, the problem was when you think about Lithuania, that's where problems become visible, that, you know, the Vilnius area was, the Poles were busy with that, and the Lithuanians had problems with Memel and with the Germans. And there was also the thing, if you wanted to have cooperation with whom and how much do you trust? And Estonia and Latvia talked to Finland, talked to Poland, but the Finns, for example, didn't really trust the Poles, so they didn't really want to be lumped together in a regional club that included Poland. I mean, I mentioned earlier in my answer, you know, each of them in some ways was separate, even if they had the same security issue, namely this issue that you are somehow sandwiched between the Soviet Union, and the question is whether that will expand and will want the old provinces back, and between Germany that's becoming increasingly aggressive. And if we leave Finland slightly to the north, and it has this Grand Duchy background, then nevertheless, even among the three to create something regional, that was then perhaps looking for support in the West, that wasn't forthcoming. There was too much distrust, there was also infighting, they were going in different directions. You know, in Lithuania, for a long time, the Catholic Party had been very strong, but then it turns more right-wing. I told already, you know, that there's differences also with regard to these different elites who is having influence. And to say, okay, so the Second World War in some ways shows, here's this question of the agency. Can small powers be agents? I think up to a point, yes, but like Kaya said, you know, the circumstances weren't good. The League of Nations didn't function. It was very difficult for small powers to survive between two aggressive big powers. So there can be agency, but it's difficult. On the other hand, because of the way it panned out between the big powers, they became the pawns. And by the time they became occupied, you know, first by one side and then by the other side, so Soviet and then again German and then again Soviet, then in the end they're incorporated, then that is the outcome. And that outcome is of course different from the outcome that Finland had after the Winter War, then from 41 onwards, the continuation war as a co-belligerent with Germany and their own ambitions to get Karelia back. And that was all very fraught. But in the end, they maneuvered themselves out of a situation that as a defeated nation, nevertheless, they're the only country of those defeated nations that came out keeping its independence. And the question has been raised by historians, you know, that's what we keep looking at, you know, has that something got to do with what happened in 39? You know, if you fought, maybe that earned you some respect with the Russians, but at the same time, you know, if you're much smaller, Estonia is much smaller and territorially much more vulnerable than, say, Finland is. So, you know, the outcomes are different. But quickly on the Cold War, as we move into the Cold War, the Germans got punished through division. And the country on the Western side that considered itself also as the Reichsnachfolger, the continuation of the Reich, historically speaking, with all its liabilities, faced a dilemma, morally and politically. How to deal with the non-recognition policy that was forthcoming from the countries like United States, Britain, countries where you also still had legations. We must not forget these countries got occupied and incorporated, but their diplomatic services in several countries still continued to exist, and their recognition was not de jure. So in Britain and America, they could speak much more strongly to this legal question. And the problem was that until West Germany even had its own government, namely in the first 5 years, it was totally left to the victor powers how they would touch the Baltic question. After that, the Baltic question and the German question went for the West German government, the Adenauer government, and whatever followed, always together. These were the two unresolved questions of World War II when it comes to territory and boundaries and whether there will be unification or not. There was the German question and the Baltic question. And when the Germans made their treaty with the Soviet Union, West Germany and the Soviet Union in 1955, Adenauer explicitly had a piece of paper saying that this would not, diplomatic relations being established, would not mean that either side would recognize the other's territory. But the Germans did not explicitly state anything on their non-recognition policy because they were afraid for their own German question. And one final point, for the Germans, as part of the German question, there was always this issue about East Prussia. That is, you see, in the Soviet territory. It's to this day another sort of complicated remnant of that time, and something that the Soviet Union and then now Russia is using as in, oh, if the Germans would want that back, and if that isn't entirely resolved, then that's their way into the Baltic area. I mean, if you think about propaganda warfare, then this Kaliningrad-Königsberg issue keeps coming up. But just to come back to this, throughout the Cold War, these were the two unresolved legal issues when it came also to the wording, the right to self-determination. Only the Germans could speak out, but they would only speak out to themselves.
Well, really, thank you to the three of you. I think we've come to the end of the first part of the conversation. Where Christina left it, the unresolved questions and how they've come through to the future, takes us very well to the second part of our conversation. Why does it all matter now? And I'm going to go through how 80 years later have the events in 1940 influenced the politics and life of each of the Baltic states, then the Soviet Union and Russia, then Germany and the European Union, then the UK. So have a discussion around these points. And I'm going to ask Kaya to kick off on the Baltic states themselves, but I'm going to add to that a couple of questions we've got from Naman Hapto, a postgraduate student at the Faculty of History in Cambridge. And they've asked two questions. How did Baltic Nazi collaboration, emphasize this is the question, the wording of the person asking the question, impact Soviet perception of the Baltic inhabitants? Was it justified or not? And then a second related question, what is the future of ethnic Russian minority rights in the Baltic states with respect to language, citizenship, etc.? They're not the same question, but they're related. And I wonder, Kaya, if you could kick us off around the general theme of what was the impact of all this on the Baltic states themselves. Kaya.
Thank you. I think we need to go into the history of 1940. I was trying to avoid it, but I think we still need to do this. I'm afraid this is also sort of an excursion into this alternative history, what if history. Christina already mentioned a couple of times that there were different options still on the table. I mean, Finland did fight the war, and the Baltic countries also had the option to take up the arms against the Soviet ultimatum. And even if in the history writing it's sort of silent submission, I mean, the ultimatum was very, very real. It is documented. And it was the use of threat to gain its goals, which were not so very subtly formed as Soviet interests to get access to the Baltic Sea and to secure its borders in this international situation as it was. So we did have an option, and there was willingness to fight, no doubt about this. It was the government decision, not the armed forces or the nation's decision to surrender. And to this day, I actually mentioned part of an element of shame in this for us in our national psyche. To this day, we do have debates. What if we had taken up fight? And with hindsight, once again, it's difficult to imagine even more suffering and destruction for the Baltic states than actually occurred. So in this comparison, maybe the end result would have been much the same as for physical destruction. Now, psychologically, of course, there will be a lot of honor and glory for the Baltic countries, but there might also have been a different attitude, even from Churchill, who knows? I mean, I'm inclined to think that it wouldn't have made any difference, because, I mean, in the end, Poland fought, and what did it matter in the Second World War or after the Second World War? But it would have put us in a different position, and probably also it would be much more clear in the people's minds, this question about Nazi collaboration and how do the Russians perceive this. Before Nazi collaboration, we did have a year of Soviet occupation. And I'm not going into any details, but it just sets the scene. And what Russia uses as a sort of a narrative now, historical narrative internationally, is of course a claim on a democratic choice for the Baltic countries. Well, the elections were fake. It was all a puppet theater, nothing else in 1940. The Nazi occupation was not greeted as a sort of liberation for the Baltic countries. I'm sorry, but the Baltic Germans were not the very best friends in the Baltics. We had hundreds and hundreds of years of repression and this type of landlord attitude, which was not very well taken by the Baltic nations. So we were very, very clear that the two powers were fighting each other, and we just had to find our niche here. That Russia uses this Nazi occupation as a kind of a card in the historical narrative at the moment is up to them. I mean, it's possible to make all kinds of arguments. Doesn't necessarily have to be true. Once again, coming back to my mother, she told me that any Estonian boy recruited into the German army was actually fighting for Estonia. And they proved this by coming back from Finland in 1944, when the German army was already withdrawing, and the Estonian troops were left alone on the border river of Narva, and they really fought for the Republic of Estonia and not for Nazi Germany at that time. But of course, for the Russians, what did it matter? It was a resistance towards the liberating Soviet army, as they put it. And I also come back to the question of the ethnic Russians in Estonia. It is, of course, a sensitive and difficult one, because after the Second World War, there was a huge inflow of Soviet immigrants, which threatened to destroy the ethnic balance in Estonia altogether. In 1991, I think we had, can't remember now exactly, but certainly over 30% of Russians in Estonia. Some of them did leave, many stayed, but most of them with this sort of a Soviet identity, never having to actually understand what country they do live in, never having learned the language, and so on and so on. In restoring the Estonian Republic in 1991, we restored also the main legal principle, which is the citizenship on the basis of the heritage. So those who were citizens in 1940, be they Germans or Russians or Estonians or Swedes, had this automatic citizenship the others had the option of naturalization. And this remains so to this day in Estonia. Now, more and more Estonian Russians, of course, have come to take the Estonian citizenship. Not everybody, but well, I don't think that there is much debate about it anymore. I think the Estonian nation today certainly consists of very different minorities, and I hope we will be seeing a bright future for everybody soon enough. It's a complicated question. I could go on and on about it, but I'll stop here.
Kai, can I thank you for dealing with that, as you say, complicated question in a very sensitive and difficult way. Just the way you answered illustrated the feelings and complexities of the question. Thank you. I'm now going to ask Christina to answer the same question. How have events in 1940 influenced the politics and life of the Soviet Union, Russia, and Germany? I'm going to ask if you deal with both of those, Christina, and to attach a question that's come in from Katerina Platere from the Latvian embassy, and she asks, what are the actual risks posed by modern Russia's revisionist approach to the 20th century history? What can and should be done with regard to Russia's attempts to distort the history and even step back from previous decisions? For instance, the State Duma's intention to revoke the 1989 resolution of the USSR Congress of People's Deputies condemning the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. I know that's a big question, Katerina. I'm asking you to talk about quite a lot, and we may go on this one of the future to do it at the end bit, but can you make a first stab at dealing with the impact on the Soviet Union and Russia and Germany and the EU in this process? And I know it's an area you've written about a lot.
Okay, I will use on some ways also the end of the Cold War and the independence, regaining independence as a hook. But something that ties back to what Kaya highlighted and which I would just like to underline is we must have no illusions that in the Soviet time there was a planned Russification going on in the three Baltic states, most aggressively in Latvia, really trying to make Russified as much as possible. That would have then, broken up those three republics and taken their identities away. And why is that important? Because think about a type of population shift. 30% of Estonians after in the war and after the war were sent to the gulags, mostly the intellectual elite. And instead, you get flooded with Soviet workers who work in Narva in the factories. So you also have an entirely different societal situation. And something else picking up from that is how in this period of Sovietization and being in the Soviet Union, for example, let's use Estonia as an example, did the contacts to the West stay? And the first president, Lennart Meri, is a fine example, who spoke a lot of languages, who could read books. Estonians also, just like the East Germans could watch West German TV, Estonians on the coast could watch Finland's TV. Well, the Russian speakers could not, so they did not know. So, I mean, there's sort of different ways in which you hold on to who you are as a nation. And when the opening and the reforming in the Soviet Union began under Gorbachev, we must also have no illusions. It wasn't about giving them the independence. It was about making the Soviet Union more functioning, make the society more functioning, rejuvenate the society, reform the economy. And then in that context, Gorbachev felt that actually for it to work, it had to be also political. And in some ways, the Baltic republics were a showcase to the West, because of course they were more advanced, given that they also had background and actually experience with democracy and capitalism from the 20s and 30s. But for example, economically, much more perestroika. In Estonia, you had this project IME. Then political devolution. Each republic had supposed sort of foreign ministries. Well, but once each republic established using its own language, not Russian, you begin to move into change and reform begins to turn into, they use the word secession in the West, but actually the real word that should be used is the re-establishment and the regaining of independence, for which, however, you need international recognition. And that's where, in some ways, the German-Russian relationship comes back very big into play, because you all know the story about German unification, 1989, 1990, and it had to do with the self-determination of the Germans and the wrapping up through the 2+4 treaty. And what happens in that time when in the Baltics you have the singing revolution going on, this push for gaining independence, the declarations of independence, the first democratic elections that took place to these congresses of people's deputies, the national congresses. Helmut Kohl said, well, I'm not going to talk about the Baltics with Bush and Gorbachev. We have to wrap up the German thing first. So, you know, it's always a question of priorities. And Margaret Thatcher said, well, we have bigger fish to fry. The most important thing is to keep Gorbachev in power, not go on with our, you know, non-recognition policy. So what is interesting, however, in this period, when also under Gorbachev, you know, and there was a Baltic chain in August 1989 to remind the world and to you know, make people aware of the Hitler-Stalin pact. Very important, that Baltic chain of the people, for the symbolism, for reaching the world media. And the recognition from the boss in the Soviet Union that this annex existed to the treaty. Why does that matter? It matters because it's like going over the history and then trying to move forward. And this continues beyond that then regaining of independence after the August coup in 1991 and then the disintegration of the Soviet Union. This was a period when we moved out of the Cold War into a new era where there was a sense of goodwill and win-win and trying to cooperate together. That is what Putin is now trying to rewrite, because to him, Gorbachev and the disaster of the collapse of the Soviet Union and the wider Soviet Empire is the biggest disaster in the 20th century. Think about that today when we are seeing a parade about the Soviets, the Russians as liberators from World War II. He said that's the biggest catastrophe, the collapse of the Soviet Union. And the 1990s are a catastrophe. He's trying to democratize Russia and the Yeltsin years. Putin looks back and to rewrite the past, to give people a sense of pride in Russia as a great power, because he cannot give them something that looks into the future. So he tries to rewrite the past to make it fit. And that's why very selectively certain elements get picked out. Just like what always gets picked out, this issue about that NATO survived the Cold War. That was an agreed thing between Gorbachev, Bush, and Kohl. There was nothing untoward. And what other countries would later want in terms of joining clubs was up to them. And Yeltsin did not dispute that. In fact, Putin himself in 2004 did not dispute Baltic accession to the NATO. That is something that has come much later, and especially in the context after the intervention and annexation of Crimea and in the Ukraine. So we have to always think, in which context does the rewriting of history and the putting forward of certain text and trying to influence our thinking of how we look at the past, when does this come into play? And why is everywhere this you know, the Great Patriotic War now being celebrated and used as contextualization for museums all around Russia? It has to do with re-establishing Russia's identity as a great power in the minds of the Russian people.
Katrina, thank you very, very much. And I'm now going to go to Patrick to ask you the same question about how do those events change British thinking about this? And perhaps if you've got comments on the European Union's approach as a whole, I think that would be interesting as well. Patrick.
Going back a bit, I've been relatively negative about British policy, but I think I would like to remind people that going right back to 1939, Britain did not agree to the Soviet inclusion of the Baltic states in its definition of indirect aggression. They actually aborted the alliance negotiations in the summer of 1939 on that basis. Germany, of course, wasn't so scrupulous. And secondly, Britain did do quite a lot to maintain the Baltic diplomatic presence in London throughout that period. It's very clear from Tina Taman's biography of the last Estonian ambassador in London, August Torma, that all three legations were being supported by Secret Service funds, basically, throughout that period. I don't think that's in dispute any longer. So the British were doing their modest best to keep the Baltic presence going. They were consistent in the whole question of de facto recognition. British pragmatism, which I've indicated already, I think is present, and British values, I would say, also mean that when the Baltic states became independent or regained their independence in 1991, Britain's position shifted dramatically in favour of commitment. And this, of course, was reinforced when they joined the EU and NATO in 2004. And I think now, if you look at all three countries from the British perspective, I think maybe especially Estonia, because it's so innovative in so many ways in digitally and so on. Britain is really looking to these countries really for examples of all sorts of social and economic models they can copy. I'm jumping about a bit because I'm not going to talk much about EU membership, but there are, very important ways in which Britain has shown commitment to the Baltic republics, Baltic states in recent years. The biggest one, I suppose, is its military presence in the Eastern Baltic. From 2017 onwards, British forces have been deployed in Estonia as part of NATO's enhanced forward presence. And last year, Operation Baltic Protector was a Royal Navy-led exercise with 2,000 Royal Navy personnel operating in the Baltic to show Britain's commitment and as NATO's commitment as a whole under Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty, that the defence of one is the defence of all. Another more modest example, but quite intriguing and not all that well known, I think, is the way in which Britain was determined to include the Baltic states in what started under the early days of David Cameron's government, in what started as a UK Nordic Baltic network. This was a way in which innovative individuals, individual companies would get together right across the northern sphere, from Britain through Scandinavia, through Finland and the Baltic. And this is probably the nearest I'm going to come to revealing anything remotely secret, but there was a discussion right at the beginning about whether the Baltic states should be included in a British Scandinavian network. And it was a very clear decision that they should be. And indeed, that was one that was vindicated by the subsequent evolution of that network into what's now called the Northern Future Forum. So that in this modest way, but quite imaginative way, it went right the way through the Cameron years. Of course, there was a blip, a decided blip after the Brexit vote, but it was revived again by Mrs. May's attendance at the most recent of these summit meetings in Oslo. Britain has reversed, in a way, its cautious and attitude towards the Baltic states has become much more supportive, seeing them far more, I think, as an integrated part of the EU, which we're soon to leave, and which we've already left, and NATO.
Patrick, thank you very, very much indeed. Again, I think that's been a very useful going through the issues about why it's important. I think it'd be difficult to listen to those three contributions without really acknowledging this history from 80 years ago has a massive impact today. But now I'm going to move to the final session of our discussion today. How does the future look? And I'm going to firstly ask, and I'll start again with Kaya, how serious are the current challenges to the independence of the Baltic states? This has been touched upon a bit already in what's been said, but I'm also going to add in a question that's come in from Violetta Carolina, a recent graduate of the City University in London, when she says, on the 1st of July this year, the constitutional election will take place in Russia. As everyone predicts, this will change the system to suit the preferences of the current government in Russia even more. How might this impact the relationship with the Baltic states? So perhaps you could take account of that question, Kaya, in addressing the question of how serious the current challenges to the independence of the Baltic states are.
Yes, thank you. A huge question once again. But let me start once again with 1940 and what really happened there. Obviously, the ruling thought at that time in Europe was that the world is probably, well, rightly or wrongly, but it is divided into spheres of influence. And now we see that there are countries, and Russia among them, who would happily live on in this sort of the world. And how 1940 impacted the Baltic thinking was never again. So we had absolutely no doubt what to do when we regained the independence in 1991. The orientation of the Baltic countries was crystal clear from day one. Well, it took us some time, but again, in hindsight, not so much actually. So we joined the European Union and NATO in 2004. And I wish I could say lived happily ever after. We lived happily until 2014 with this another quite shameful and actually also surprising and unexpected move from Russia to take over Crimea, whatever technical legal term you use there. And very quickly, articles popped up all over the world with a headline, "Is Narva next?" Well, the nice alliteration is a hint towards the border town between Russia and Estonia. And the implication, of course, is that is Putin going to use the same tactics in the Baltic countries? And my very bold claim is it probably never was the intention. If it was a terrible blunder. But they have once again shot themselves into the foot, because if there ever was an intent to somehow create something provocational on the border between Estonia and Russia, it would have been so much more easy before Crimea than after the Crimea. Because what has happened actually is reinforced NATO presence in the Baltic countries. Patrick already referred to this. Estonia was lucky to get the British troops. We are really regarding ourselves lucky because of some historical ties and so on. And I think it's a sort of a circular argument here that you can, of course, put the question that why do the British boys and girls need to die for the Baltic independence? And when push comes to shove, they probably don't need to do this. But the pure fact that they are stationed here now probably says that there is no real danger of ever needing to do this. This is what NATO is for. Again, as a circular argument, if you deploy NATO forces as a deterrent and the deterrent is successful, you never actually get to test it because the attack never happens. And for the British troops here, I think everybody in the UK can be quite assured that they are not in any danger here, because they are here acting as a tripwire. And the tripwire was set after Crimea, not before Crimea. So once again, to come back to this, if anything, I think I feel more secure now than before Crimea. So hopefully we can live happily ever after in the European Union and NATO, but I must underline that the European Union is actually at least half of the feeling of security in the Baltic countries. It's not only military presence, it's much more this interlinkages, economical, psychological, whatever. And I would also like to recall that actually NATO has never been tested in Europe. Of course, we do believe in NATO, but what has been tested is the European Union many times over in all sorts of crises. So I think we are very lucky, and we have also been very wise choosing our family. Once we have chosen the family, we would like this family to be strong. So I'm sorry that we don't have Brits anymore in the European Union. Pretty soon, that's a different debate. But the Brits have said that they do remain in Europe. So whatever the Russian ideas and rewriting of the history might be starting from the 1st of July, I don't think it will make any difference. Thank you.
Thank you, Kai. That's a very optimistic story. No, it's one I personally agree with, but it's on the optimistic side. And it does raise the question of how committed are NATO, the UK and the US to the security and independence of the Baltic states today. And I don't think it's unfair to say that some of the comments of the current President of the United States of America have given rise to some doubts and questions. And the recent biography by John Bolton, his former national security advisor, also raises questions on that. And I'm going just to ask Christina if she would like to comment on how strong she thinks NATO, UK, US are in their commitment to the Baltic states today.
Yeah, I quite happily do so. In fact, I think I could widen it ever so slightly by saying the enhanced forward presence that Patrick mentioned by NATO is, you know, the Brits in Estonia, the Canadians in Latvia, the Germans in Lithuania, and the Americans in Poland. So actually we have 4 countries who have this revolving deployment. And that's actually an important term, because it's always this question, are these, you know, bases where Americans, for example, are based all the time, or is it something that keeps revolving? That is important in view of you know, what Russia says when it talks about being encircled by NATO. And I thought Kaya very well explained how deterrence works. And that is really, really important, because, you know, to put it in the wider picture, you know, if you look at the last 30 years, and I use this to look into the future, then of course, you know, what did we see in the 90s when we were also very hopeful? And we saw this enlargement of these 2 clubs because the countries from Central and Eastern Europe and Northern Europe wanted to join them. And I would, you know, to link it back to what I said earlier about the early part of the 20th century, Finland chose not to join NATO given its own particular background, how it manages with the Russians, but joining the EU with Sweden in 1995 was absolutely imperative and important to really indicate, you know, where that Western orientation is, so that there cannot be talk about Finlandization and so forth. Now, if we think about where we are today, then we must not just think about the military, but that's why these words and this rhetoric and the rewriting of history and how commemorations take place matters. It's how you play with people's minds and society's minds and how they vote. And that's why I think we have to pay attention. You know, why do the Russians you know, say that the Finns attacked them when the Winter War began? Why is there discussions about prisoners of war? Why is there so much obfuscation about lots of things? It's throwing lots of different arguments and ideas into the mix, and it's messing with people's minds because nobody can then easily work out what's fact and what's fiction. And that's really important also if we think about the young people we educate, the young people who vote, and if we also think about what's happening here in the United States. I mean, the Trump administration has been a real problem for, you know, how NATO can function when all the time it's one big chaos. And, you know, the chaos, by chaos, I also mean, you know, one day it was the impeachment and another day it was the COVID and then it was the protest and every day it's something else. And people have already forgotten what was 3 months ago or a year ago or whatnot. So these elections that are coming up are very important also in terms of how that alliance functioning will take place, because we know what the generals think of this, we know what even a hawk like John Bolton thinks, But none of these people really said very much when they're actually supporting that administration. And for an alliance to function, you need to have trust and cooperation, and you need to go into the same direction. And for that, you need stable leadership. You need to be able to trust the word. And I mean, as many Americans recognize, America is strong because it has allies. It's the alliance that makes it strong, not just by standing by itself and being isolationist. Equally, you could say, maybe we shouldn't pay too much attention to many of the things Putin says, because how many allies has Russia really got? And Russia and Putin are looking very much to their own domestic audience. He has to, justify what's going on, where he wants to go, that he wants to stay as a leader. And these other things are about undermining what's going on in the neighborhood. But it's not new. In the 1990s, there was talk about the near abroad. Russia never got over the fact that the Red Army had to withdraw from the Eastern and Central European states. And it took 4 years, it took 7 years. This is a sense of humiliation, which they are to this day grappling with. And that's what's making this also uncertain. All these things that are being thrown into the mix, and that you don't have a great sense of, what is it exactly we are looking for? What is we say in German, Zukunftshorizont? Even among the Western leaders, who is providing us a sense, this is where we want to be in 4 or 5 years. The confusion comes because you have a leader in Russia who seems to be there all this time, and then you have a leader in China who says by 2050, China is the next big superpower. And before you know it, you have this authoritarian long-term vision and pushing out of ideas, and on the other hand, this uncertainty in Europe. And that needs work from the leaders, I think, to give the populations a sense of, what is our future? What are the things we want to hold on to? What kind of societies do we value living in, including free speech, factual information, all these kind of things?
Christina, you're raising very big questions, which I think are slightly wider than the Baltic States issues. I think the challenge that you're putting is a true one. It's a correct one, more generally. The questions have to be raised very sharply. Perhaps I could just put, before coming to Patrick, a question that's come from Robert Moore, who says he's a retired Cambridge academic. I didn't know any Cambridge academics were ever retired. I thought they always went on forever. In which he says, President Macron describes NATO as brain dead and argues instead for a European army. And he wonders, would the Baltic states consider this to be acceptable? Just before coming to Patrick, I'd be interested in any comments that, Christina, you have on this, and then Kaya, and then I'll come to Patrick.
I think you have to understand that Macron comes very much from a Gaullist tradition, and it's very much in the French interest to put this forward, because that would make France the strongest power. Because without Britain in the EU and Germany not being a nuclear power, that leaves France in the driving seat. If he had his way, then I think there would be several countries that would be deeply unhappy. I'm not sure that the Germans would go along with it, and I'm not sure that that is necessarily what the smaller countries in Northeastern Europe would want either.
Thank you. And Kaya, what do you think the Baltic states would think of this proposal of President Macron's?
I was preparing to answer the question, what do you think? What do we think about NATO being brain dead? I am not going to.
I know you're a diplomat, and so I wasn't sure if you'll able to respond to that question.
No, I'm actually saying that this was a provocative comment, which was meant to be provocative. And provocations sometimes actually create quite a good discussion. So whatever we can do to increase our capacities, either in NATO or in the European Union, is good for us. No problem with this. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, Patrick, I was going to ask you what you think the future UK role and interest in the Baltic states is, but you've answered that partly in your answer in the previous area with the relationships that you described between the UK and the Baltic states and also the Scandinavian states. But taking Christina's challenge of a clarity of vision for the future, do you think there is a British clarity of vision for the future of how these relationships should go? Is it simply a question of having a network that's there, or is it about more than that?
think it's more than that. And if one could pull back from the Baltic states to look at the whole sphere of Northern Europe, we've got a southern Baltic axis, as it were, but from Denmark, Germany, and Poland, and a northern one, which would really extends from Iceland to Norway to Sweden and Finland. And we have defence relationships right across the board. They're flexible. They're not. They vary. There are different organisations involved, and our depth of commitment varies. But I think they form part of. I can't really speak for the British government, but much of the 20th century was dominated by a lack of vision in that part of the world from the British point of view. I think that's much of my work has really been, how little the British understood Northern Europe. I don't think that's the case anymore. I think there are all sorts of diplomats and defense specialists who understand, and academics for that matter, who understand how important those relationships are. And I don't think Britain is ever going to retreat again into any form of isolation. And I don't actually think Brexit means isolation either. It's challenging. And we're faced with the big, ostensibly we're faced with big decisions, Europe versus America and so on. But I actually think that the perception really on the British side is that we can do a lot more now in ways that perhaps we couldn't before, to reinforce our relationships, our bilateral relationships with countries in Europe, our defence relationships through a series of networks, partly involving NATO, partly not. I think that might be a much more positive and optimistic vision to look forward to. And if one moved away really from the defence and security sphere, I mean, what we're quite good at, I think, is being quite innovative in all sorts of ways, technologically and so on. And I think, unlike most of the 20th century, when we thought we probably knew all the answers, I think in the 21st century, we actually know that countries, ostensibly small countries like Estonia or Finland, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, they all are very good at doing certain things. And I think if I can return to this Northern Future Forum concept, what it's been aimed to do is really to learn from those experiences and to share experiences. The difficulty, I think, and it's nearly always the difficulty, is moving beyond these official networks. How do you, in the 19th and 20th century, it was, how can you possibly persuade British exporters to sell goods that Scandinavians actually want to buy and to go out and sell them? In the 21st century, the challenges still exist. But I think British business and British technology has actually been quite strong in its relationship with the Baltic states since they regained their independence. I could think, for instance, of the way in which the Know-How Fund was promoted throughout Eastern Europe and even in Russia in the 90s to promote all sorts of ways in which these societies could move beyond the rigid Soviet models. This was done really on a shoestring and very, very successfully, just by getting experts on the one side and receptive people on the other to talk to each other. And that's happening in both ways now. The British are very much listening, I think, to what's going on in the Baltic states and elsewhere. So I look forward with some optimism, if you like. The challenges are certainly there. We haven't even talked about COVID throughout the last hour and a half, or hour and a quarter, but we haven't even begun to absorb really what the coronavirus crisis will mean for our societies. Everything that happens from now on will, I think, be coloured by the experience of recent months. So I'm not going to make any predictions, but I just think that there's a remarkable degree of openness really on the British side.
Thank you very much, Patrick. We're now just a couple of minutes from the end. I've had one question asking you, Patrick, if Brexit isn't isolation, what it is, but I'm not going to ask you that. It's too broad a question for this conversation. So I'll just conclude in this last 30 seconds or so by asking if either Kaya or Christina has any wind-up remark that you would like to make for the end of this seminar.
I would, yes, thank you. I would express my dear wish that there were more academic literature and research on 1940 or 1939, either in the Baltic States or the UK role in the Baltic States. Because I think what history has taught us is that small states actually do matter. And if you don't take the events in the small states seriously, it will cascade into something much more dangerous, and you cannot really isolate yourself from this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kaya. A very profound end. Christina, is there any final remark you'd like to make?
I would just add to that, I would encourage anybody who's considering that kind of research to also go out and learn the languages, because if you really want to look at these things from the different angles and work out exactly how each side presented it to itself, as much as how much they negotiated with each other, that is what you need to do. You really have a multi-angle approach to work out exactly how the interactions function. And of course, it's also beneficial to the present day, because as diplomats know, you have to be able to put yourself in the shoes of the other side, as much as knowing exactly where your own red lines are. And I think what we are seeing in that region is relative stability in managed tensions.
Well, I'd like to say thank you very much to our panel. I think it's been an outstanding discussion, actually. I've certainly found it absolutely fascinating. And I'd like to thank all three of them for their time, insight, and wisdom, which I think has helped our understanding. I'd also like to echo the call for more academic work and research on this period. I certainly discovered in trying to understand more about it that there is simply not a lot written about it, perhaps because they are small countries. But what became very clear in this conversation this evening has been their importance and significance for a whole series of much wider questions. And I think the more that attitudes and so on are understood and the actual history is understood, the better. I'd like to reiterate my thanks to Professor Brendan Sims and his colleagues at the Centre for Geopolitics at Cambridge University for taking the initiative and making this happen, for what, as I say, I think has been a very successful approach. And I hope that we will be coming back to you in the future about future events. Just to remind you, this event is recorded and you will be able in the next few days to find it on the Centre for Geopolitics website at www.cfg.polis.cam.ac.uk. And so if you've not got friends who you think might have been interested but didn't know about it, please spread it. So with that, I'm going to close this webinar to thank everybody for participating, and in particular to thank the panel for the wisdom that they've offered us this evening. Thank you very much.